Hello and welcome everyone to today's excellent webinar looking at wellbeing budgets in Australia and New Zealand, what we can learn from each other. My name is Dr. Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and one of the directors of the New Economy Network Australia. NENA is an organisation working across Australia, particularly within civil society, that brings individuals and organisations together to share information, work in a peer-to-peer fashion, showcasing and sharing innovative and amazing and groovy new things so that we can build an economy that is most excellent for planet and people. I'm also very delighted that NENA a couple of years ago became the host body for We All Australia. So the Wellbeing Economy Alliance at the international level started over in Europe, where people were starting to really seriously explore what wellbeing economics looks like. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. I actually wanted to acknowledge country. It's an important tradition here in Australia and other colonised nations to recognise, honour and respect the First Nations peoples on whose land we live, work and play. And I am fortunate enough to live, work and play in the beautiful lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples here in what is now known as North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and the emerging leaders who are continuing an ancient custodian responsibility to care for country and to care for each other. NENA also likes to acknowledge the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonisation and the work that NENA and our sister organisations, AILA, Future Dreaming and other groups are involved in is about decolonising our hearts and minds and finding a future that is sustainable for all peoples within our local places. So we're really delighted to be looking at wellbeing economics today, because this is at the very heart of what many of us would say are the core problems within industrialised societies. We challenge growth economics inside the New Economy Network. We're interested in how we can live in places in a healthy way forever. And that means not taking too much, and dare I say it, even thinking about the living world beyond human needs and interests. So NENA has got a whole range of ways of connecting into the current rather remarkable ways of transforming economic systems. We connect with We All and Wellbeing Economics, as well as groups like the New Economy Coalition and the New Economy Foundation overseas. But more importantly, here in Australia, we have a beautiful growing network of lots of different sectoral hubs and our geographic hubs, meaning place-based groups, who were doing quite well until COVID hit and everything went online. Next year, we're going to see the resurrection of a lot of wonderful regional symposia. I will share the New Economy updates at the end of this session, but I think that's probably enough from me. What I'd like to do is just quickly hand over to Gareth Hughes to say his greetings and welcome you on behalf of his wonderful group over in New Zealand. Hello, Gareth. How are you today?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. I'd just like to welcome everyone and start with a karakia, a traditional Māori meeting opening, which is whakatakatahau ki te uru, whakatahau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, I he aki ana te ake hura, hi tua, hi huka, hi hauhu, ti hei Māori ora. So in English, I just said, cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south, let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean, let the red-tipped dawn come with the sharpened air, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. So lovely to see you all. I'm Gareth Hughes, the country lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa New Zealand. E whana mai au e taha o te awa o Tarawhiti Gisborne, I raro I te maru o te maunga o Kaiti, he uri aho no Wales, Scotland, ki te noho o ke Otapoti Dunedin, ko Gareth Hughes toku ingoa. Just to introduce myself, I grew up in Gisborne, my ancestors came from Wales and Scotland, and I live in the bottom of the South Island in Dunedin. So I'm really glad to be joining this webinar and co-hosting with the New Economy Network Australia. Thanks everyone for attending and for the speakers for participating. I'm really looking forward to it. There's a bit of a friendly rivalry between New Zealand and Australia that's played out on the sports field and on the dessert table. You know, who did really create pavlova first? As a patriotic Kiwi, it gives me some pride seeing Canberra following Wellington by some years in introducing federal wellbeing budgets and chapters. So we won that one like we won the pavlova. But look, I've lived in Aussie, I was engaged there, worked in Australia, and I would note a lot of the developments in New Zealand both in terms of the Wellbeing Framework and the Living Standards Framework, actually come in date and were pioneered in Australia from the early 2000s. But for me, I think, well, jokes aside, what's important isn't who was first or what's the competition, but how both countries can actually collaborate and improve decision-making and jointly boost the well-being of both peoples. You know, when you look around the world, we're facing multiple crises at the moment. It's often described as a polycrisis these days. And it's not just the well-being of our people imperiled with things like inequality or the cost of living crisis, but it's the natural world that's at stake. And I think that's highlighted particularly in our minds as we have the COP27 climate talks about to start. And on that note, can I just quickly acknowledge the passing of Herman Daly, who sadly died yesterday. He was a Nobel Prize winning economist who pioneered the field of ecological economics. So today, governments around the world can't ignore the environment like they did once upon a time, or they did at the World Bank when Herman Daly worked there. But he today would be, I believe, urging us to keep making sure the natural world was embedded in all of our thinking, and the decisions we make as individuals or businesses or governments respect those natural boundaries. So to deal with the polycrisis, it's going to take new thinking in economics, new thinking in the way government deals with challenges. And I think the wellbeing developments on both sides of the Tasman so far are really positive examples, and they're drawing international attention. So on behalf of WEAL, can I thank NENA for co-hosting and all the work they've done prepping this event today. WEAL Aotearoa is a relatively new organisation. We've been around for a few years in New Zealand, a little bit longer internationally. I describe WEAL Aotearoa as like a think tank and a do tank. Our mission is to support a broad-based movement in Aotearoa that builds momentum to transform the economic system towards a wellbeing economy, one that delivers fairness for people, for dignity, purpose, participation, and nature, an economy that delivers for people and planet. We're part of a global growing alliance that's got hundreds of organizations as part of our alliance, dozens of spokespeople, including some modern day thought leaders like Kate Raworth, Tim Jackson, and others. We've got hubs in 15 countries, of which Aotearoa New Zealand is one of them. We've got some big ambitious plans for the next year, including a roadshow to envision what a new economy could look like, a national conference next year, and people can find out more about us on our website. Looking forward to the conversation. Thanks very much, Michelle. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you, Gareth, for a fabulously efficient overview of all the wonderfulness of WEAL International and WEAL New Zealand. So what I'll do now is I'll introduce all of our speakers so that you know who they are, and then I'll take the spotlight off everyone except Simon, who's going to be our first speaker today. So let me introduce you to our lovely guests today. And we do have an apology from Stacey Weimer from New Zealand Treasury, who was on the original list of speakers. She was called away for official duties, but very kindly organised for Simon Duncan to speak in her stead. And Simon, thanks so much for stepping up so very quickly. So Simon is the manager of the New Zealand Treasury's budget team, and he's responsible for supporting the Minister of Finance and the New Zealand government to deliver its annual budget. Simon's trained as an economist and has been involved in numerous budgets and other areas of public finance in his 13-year career at Treasury. And in terms of our other lovely speakers, we'll then hear from Paul Dalziel. Paul has been Professor of Economics at Lincoln University since 2002 and Deputy Director of its Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit since 2010. So we'll hear from our New Zealand colleagues first, and then we'll hand over to hear some of the really quite remarkable and interesting work going on in Australia, not just the federal budget, which has emerged triumphant, I guess, after 10 years or more of a very different looking budget. But we'll have Mike Salvaris, who's the project manager for the Australian National Development Index and is one of our, I guess, co-leaders or co-chairs inside the Australian Wellbeing Economy Hub. And then Stephanie Kilpatrick. Stephanie's joined Vic Health in January 21, having previously worked in the heart of the Victorian government, including as an advisor in the Premier's private office. Stephanie's currently delivering on Vic Health's flagship Vic Health Local Government Partnership, and has a lot to say about the practicalities of engaging with wellbeing economics and budgets, because Vic Health is really leading the way in many instances in Australia, grappling with the realities of some of these issues. So really excited to hear from all of you. Simon, we'd love to introduce you now, and all of our speakers will have 15 minutes. We might have 1 or 2 questions after Simon finishes because he then has to leave. Then we'll have our other 3 speakers all in a row and have a proper Q&A at the end. So thank you so much, everyone. I'll bring our other speakers back to the spotlight shortly. But Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for having me here today. I'll just share my screen so you can see my presentation. Cool. Apologies for the last minute swap out of presenters, as Stacey Weimer, who was to present this afternoon, is now actually on a plane over to Australia to continue the dialogue we've been having with the federal government over in Australia on all things public finance, including wellbeing budgets. So I'm here to give you a brief overview on the wellbeing budget approach in New Zealand. I've got about 15 minutes, so I'll keep this brief, noting that we could spend hours talking about this subject. So turning to New Zealand's wellbeing budget process, New Zealand has now had 5 wellbeing budgets, with the first wellbeing budget being released in 2019. How we've gone about incorporating wellbeing into the budget process is by bringing wellbeing concepts and frameworks into all aspects of our budget process. The diagram on the slide, the circular diagram, shows our budget process or our budget cycle and how we've brought wellbeing into all aspects. I'll start with the top box in the middle. This reflects the first phase of our budget cycle, which we call the strategic phase of the budget. Previously, before we had a wellbeing budget process, when a government started and kicked off its budget process, it traditionally thought about traditional economic and fiscal considerations, or to put it bluntly, how much money does it have to available in the upcoming budget? What a wellbeing focus has done in our budget process is added in the ability for the government to set wellbeing objectives and budget priorities, bringing that wellbeing lens. And that's to inform budget initiative spending, initiative development, and also to guide budget decision-making. Once the strategy is set by a government, so once the government has set its wellbeing objectives and budget priorities, we then move into the phase of the budget where all of our agencies work with their ministers to develop the various spending initiatives. And these are invited into the budget process based on alignment with the budget priorities and wellbeing objectives. As part of this initiative development phase, there's a really strong focus on wellbeing and the analytical requirements that the Treasury require of agencies of each bid for new funding. Agencies are required to identify the expected impacts on wellbeing outcomes and alignment with wellbeing objectives as set by the government in that strategic phase. Following this, we then move into a phase of the budget where the Treasury gets to run the ruler over all the new spending initiatives that are being put forward by agencies and ministers. We undertake an assessment focusing on value for money. I'll talk a little bit more about how we think about value for money in a few slides. But this Treasury advice then feeds into the decision-making phase of the budget, where our key sort of ministerial decision makers, our budget ministers and cabinet, form the budget package and agree the budget package. To support this, they receive wellbeing focused advice from the Treasury, both at that individual initiative level. So how do we see wellbeing, or how do we assess wellbeing at the individual initiative level, through to what does this mean for wellbeing at an aggregate level? And that aggregate analysis really helps ministers identify gaps. So for example, if the emerging budget package is not doing enough for a certain priority area or a certain demographic. Once the budget package is agreed by Cabinet, we then sort of move into the development of the public-facing documentation and communication side of the budget, which is also bringing in a strong wellbeing focus. For example, looking back to our most recent budget 2022, there was a wellbeing outlook and approach chapter included in the main budget document, which outlines how wellbeing has been incorporated across all aspects of the budget and what the decisions mean from a wellbeing perspective. This main budget document also included a wellbeing outlook section, which uses a lot of the wellbeing indicators to provide an update on New Zealand's wellbeing status across a range of domains. And that sits alongside some of the traditional economic outlooks and fiscal outlooks that have traditionally sort of been the focus of our budget documents. Lastly, there is a feedback loop through to the next budget. And that completes the budget cycle as outlined on the slide in front of you. This is particularly trying to pick up around impact monitoring and improving the evidence base to help shape future budget initiatives and future investment decisions. A really important key development for us in this space is the forthcoming release of the Treasury's Wellbeing Report later on this month, which we hope will be a key input into influencing how governments shape their wellbeing objectives and priorities and investments in future budgets. So just to quickly recap, what has changed compared to our earlier, more traditional budget processes when we brought in this wellbeing focus? Firstly, these wellbeing objectives set early in the budget process to guide decision-making. And generally, these wellbeing objectives we've seen over the last 5 years have endured over multiple budgets. They're generally just tweaked on the margins. Secondly, there are strong requirements of agencies to undertake wellbeing analysis in the development of new spending initiatives, and also for Treasury when we go and assess those initiatives. Thirdly, we've brought in some of the wellbeing analytical frameworks, so specifically the Treasury's Living Standard Framework, and also Hiara Waiora, which is a wellbeing framework that Treasury uses to help understand Waiora, often translated as a Māori perspective on wellbeing. These wellbeing analytical frameworks support all of the phases of the budget, so our initiative development, our assessment, and development of the budget package to support decision makers. Fourthly, we have included wellbeing analysis and reporting in some of the key public-facing budget documents, so like the Wellbeing Outlook section for New Zealand. And lastly, the Treasury's Wellbeing Report, which is now a legislative requirement for the Treasury to produce one of these wellbeing reports every 4 years. Turning back to the strategic context and priorities for budgets. This slide outlines the overall priorities for Budget 2022, the budget that was released earlier this year in May. The government set itself a number of shorter-term specific budget priorities for Budget 22, and they're shown on the left of the slide. So these picks up things that are sort of high priority for the government at the time. So continuing the COVID-19 response was a big focus of Budget 2022, as well as, for example, embedding significant health reforms to our New Zealand health system. These shorter-term budget priorities sat alongside the government's wellbeing objectives. Now, these wellbeing objectives were first set back in 2019 and have endured since then, with a few tweaks on the margins. For example, you can see some references to COVID-19 back in 2019 that wasn't as relevant. So they do adjust as needed. These wellbeing objectives help anchor the budget in the longer term and provide a longer term focus on key policy areas to improve the wellbeing of New Zealanders, such as improving physical and mental wellbeing, lifting Māori and Pacific incomes and skills, and reducing child poverty. As I mentioned a few slides ago, one of the key areas of focus for the Treasury is value for money. And so looking at value for money in a bit more detail, as I mentioned earlier, value for money is a critical part of running an effective budget process. As agencies develop their new spending initiatives, we put requirements on them to ensure these initiatives have robust evidence base and an analytical basis to demonstrate value for money. We then provide an assessment of that. To guide both the development of the initiatives and also our assessments, we focus on 3 key aspects to support our value for money approach. The first aspect is value. This element aims to analyse and describe the impacts and goals of a new spending budget initiative with reference to our wellbeing analytical frameworks, and it also brings in distributional analysis too. This is where we bring in things like the Treasury's Living Standards Framework and our Hiara Waiora framework. The second aspect is alignment. This element demonstrates the extent to which the new spending initiatives being developed align to and support the government's wellbeing objectives, the government's goals, and other cross-government strategies. The third aspect is delivery. This element demonstrates and looks to provide confidence that new spending proposals, if they get supported and agreed by ministers, can actually be delivered. And this picks up things like we're in a world of low unemployment at the moment and labour market shortages. So that's a critical thing to consider when ministers are making decisions on new policy initiatives. Just to quickly, sorry, this slide is a bit busy, but just to quickly demonstrate how these value for money elements actually feed into actual advice we provide to key ministers on budget initiatives. We try to use visual aids to highlight our assessments of an initiative across these three domains, so this value, this alignment and delivery domain. As an example of this, which is advice that went up to our budget ministers and have now been sort of proactively released to the public, is shown on this slide, and we like to think it provides a helpful way for ministers to get to grips with the various new spending initiatives and to highlight where things are either really good on terms of value alignment or delivery, or where there may be concerns. So as you can imagine, an initiative rated green across all the dimensions be one where Treasury wouldn't have any concerns with ministers supporting and implementing that initiative. However, a rating of red or amber highlights an area where some changes might need to be made to ensure an initiative can actually be delivered. We also like to bring in this type of framework with visual aids because in the New Zealand budget context, we generally have hundreds and hundreds of initiatives for ministers to consider through the budget process. So to have easy visual ways of looking at complicated information is just really important to help our decision makers. Now, moving to the Treasury's Wellbeing Report. So back in 2020, the Public Finance Act 1989 was amended to legislatively require the Treasury to produce a wellbeing report every 4 years. This is what we call a stewardship document, which sits alongside some of our other strategic assessments that we do. For example, we do a long-term fiscal statement that looks at fiscal trends over 40 years. Using our living standards frameworks and indicators and the Hiara Wairora framework, the Treasury is required to describe the state of wellbeing in New Zealand, how this has changed over time, and the sustainability of and any risk to the state of wellbeing. Our first wellbeing report will be released later this month, so we're very excited about that, and we hope it will help inform the government's priorities and investment decisions in future budgets. This is my last slide, where I'll look to outline some reflections and challenges about how a wellbeing approach is being implemented more widely. Delivering a wellbeing budget back in 2019 was an important first step, but to embed wellbeing approach requires system-wide change in how the public service works. It really is a change management program on a massive scale. Our observation would be that legislative change is an important signal and a sign of commitment, but to really embed a wellbeing approach requires behavioural change and the right incentives. That's where institutional change is important, so that we get agencies working together on common outcomes and that decision-making is made on the basis of wellbeing outcomes being achieved. Underpinning all of this is the need to continue to improve our indicators and our measurement, our monitoring and evaluation. In some ways, the bottom row of the diagram on the slide, agency capability, is the most important. The need for capability amongst agencies to implement a wellbeing approach is critical to making this successful, and we are still only at the early stages of that journey. Embedding a wellbeing approach requires incorporating across all parts of government and all parts of our budget process, not just the decision-making elements. In New Zealand, we've seen this, and this has included a strong political commitment, including by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, legislative change, such as amending the Public Finance Act to bring in the Wellbeing Report, which is legislatively required by Treasury now, measuring progress, including the development of official statistics to support that measurement, setting priorities, such as setting wellbeing objectives, and finally, evaluating policy options, using sort of traditional methods such as cost-benefit analysis, as well as bringing in other wellbeing analytical tools too. So look, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for having me this afternoon. And back to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Simon. Lots of comments coming in saying how excellent it is to see this level of detail. And as I mentioned before, Simon has to leave after a couple of quick questions, so he won't be here for the longer Q&A. So let me just put a couple of questions to you. I'm actually going to abuse the role of chair for a moment and ask, someone mentioned, not much mention of the environment in there, and I wanted to ask two quick questions. One, is there a broadening out of how the living world or the environment, not so much natural resources, but the living world is being included in discussions? And the second one is, what do you think are the biggest changes that including wellbeing elements are bringing to the sort of bureaucratic discussions about a budget?
So on the first one, I think that's a very good point on the environment. It's fair to say the environment is a key part of our living standards framework and also our Hiala Wairua framework, so it is considered and brought into that. It was a criticism that was raised on the New Zealand Wellbeing Budget approach by our Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment recently. So we've been busy looking at his recommendations and seeing how we can bring in a greater environmental focus in our wellbeing budget process going forward. So that's sort of definitely an active work area. And I think there's some really interesting points here about there's unique aspects of the environment, like tipping points, that don't necessarily get when you're on a short-term budget process. It's how do you bring in those risks and tipping points into more prominence through the process. So that's definitely an area of sort of active work for the Treasury. And sorry, the second question.
The second question, what do you see are the biggest kind of changes, whether it's in the culture of how things are done? You know, what we can see a little bit of the detail, but in the bigger picture, what difference has it made to talk about wellbeing budgets instead of just a financial budget?
Yeah, so I think it's changed across multiple dimensions, and it's really helped to have wellbeing objectives that's been able to guide the public servants in terms of the policy directions and the directions for Treasury when we're providing advice and analysis. So those wellbeing objectives have been really, really powerful for grounding a wellbeing budget process through the New Zealand system. The other area where we don't yet have the perfect solution, but we've been experimenting and piloting changes is around how do you get collaboration across really, really difficult cross-cutting problems. So a lot of the problems facing New Zealand, for example, social problems, don't just sit with one ministry in our system. They're across multiple agencies. So it's how do we get them all working together on a shared objective and all working in the same direction to achieve positive wellbeing outcomes for New Zealand. So we trialled some quite interesting approaches last budget, in our budget 2022, where we looked to group what we called cluster of agencies. So we brought about a justice cluster of agencies, so all of our agencies that work on the justice sector, so our Ministry of Justice, our courts, our corrections, our police, all working together on as one in terms of coming up with a budget package, and also looking to fund them for more than one annual budget. So they received 3 budgets worth of funding in budget 2022 to try and take a bit of the short-termism out, encourage them to work together and have collective priorities that they can then invest over the sort of medium to long term. So I don't think that's just an example of one of the areas where we piloted, but that's I think a really, really important bit for the public service to continue to refine.
Break down silos, or at least connect them in different ways frequently.
Exactly.
Excellent, thank you. 2 quick questions. Michelle has asked, not me, another one. Are government agencies required to report on wellbeing in their annual budgets?
In the annual reports, yes. So
annual reports, sorry, yeah.
There is requirements to bring in wellbeing in the performance reporting aspects of the annual reports.
Excellent.
I think one of the challenges though with any annual report is how do you bring it up a level. Often a lot of the sort of performance reporting, whether it's in our estimates documentations or our annual reports, they get produced but they sort of sit on the shelf. So it's how do you then bring them up into decision making and influencing changes.
Excellent, thank you. And this is a question from Carolyn, which perhaps Paul might be able to speak to as well. What are some of the common criticisms that have been made by academics and NGOs of the wellbeing budget in New Zealand? I don't want you to dwell on it too much, but if you've got a few ideas about what people have been saying and what you guys are responding to or trying to address.
Maybe I'll hand over to Paul. You might be a bit closer to the academic debate in this space than I am.
In which case, just hold that thought before you go, Simon. There is another question from Min saying, how useful or important is the CBACS tool in assessing value for money of initiatives that align to wellbeing budget priorities?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's a little bit case by case with a lot of analytical tools. In a perfect world, everyone would be doing these sort of comprehensive cost benefit analysis that consider all wellbeing outcomes. And we do actively encourage our agencies to use CBACs and cost benefit. We build in our cost benefit requirements into the templates that agencies have to fill in, but they're not required necessarily to do a CBACs. A few years ago, we did mandate CBACs, and we had pretty poor turnout in terms of how many people could actually use it in practice, and often some of the downsides is agency capability side, so they won't have the capability to effectively use this tool. So what you'll see is that being contracted out and not actually building the capability within an agency. So I think in some areas CBACs is really, really important, and if the agency has capability and capacity to do that, that's a really important thing. That's not the only analytical tool to bring to bear.
Thank you. I'll just add one last question and then we'll let you go, because then we'll put the criticism issue back to Paul, because he's about to speak next. Nikki's asked, as someone interested in regenerative agriculture, how is land managed or handled? And I wonder if this is almost connected to my question about the environment and the living world. Have there been any changes in how it's spoken about, valued, revered or not in your system?
No, that's a bit of a curveball one for me. I think
I can't do everything, so it's early days.
But look, I think if an agency was developing an initiative that impacted the wellbeing and needed to incorporate land being included, we would encourage them to do that, to bring that focus and to support the evidence base for that initiative. That's probably how I'm not sure we've fully sort of brought that into like the living standards framework. So I think it's a good question, but if this was a critical thing for an agency in developing the initiatives, we would encourage them to.
So would it be fair to say that New Zealand's had 5 budgets and it's probably grappling with a lot of the social issues that need to be woven in, and it perhaps hasn't gone deeper yet into decolonising ideas about land and country and place? That's certainly my assessment as someone who comes from a slightly different angle.
Yeah, I think the social side, definitely. The other sort of area which has been quite a focus over the last few years has been climate.
Yeah. And
there's been a number of initiatives and approaches taken to try and address climate change too. We do have on the sort of Indigenous side, we do have the Kia Ora framework, which tries to bring in sort of the Māori perspective on wellbeing, and we're continuing to refine how that gets used in practice, and we're learning every budget that we're using these frameworks. So I think that the main point with this is it's a journey, and in every budget we're learning new things, and we are adapting and changing and hopefully
excellent.
Hopefully improving.
No, and it's just so timely that we have these conversations to see what you've been doing over there and how you are trying to adapt and evolve to ideas and criticisms and suggestions. So Simon, thank you for your time. We know that you were put on the spot literally an hour before the talk. We appreciate you sharing these insights with us. We will let you go now, and huge thank you. And if folks in Zoom world could do a little thank you clapping icon or a little air clap, that would be lovely. It's a strange world we live in where I have to ask people to press a button to clap. But thank you so much, Simon, and I'll take the spotlight off you. What I will do now is invite Paul Dalziel to speak with us, and I'll just spotlight him so you can see him. So Paul, thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to pick up on the question when you're ready. You don't have to start with it, but someone asked, what have been some of the criticisms or suggestions for New Zealand's wellbeing budget framework?
Thanks for that. Let me start with that. There have been 3 critiques. The first is that it has been more a change of language than a change of policy framework. And so the departments are now learning to use the language of well-being, but when it comes to the ultimate decision-making, much more attention is around traditional questions like value and delivery that we've just heard. And so the real substantive, transformative shift to protect the environment and to remain within planetary boundaries still has to happen. And it was mentioned, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment did an audit on the first 3 wellbeing budgets, and Simon Upton couldn't find any evidence in the budget process where environmental considerations had been decisive in any of the decisions that were being made. So more work to be done. The second is that when you're juggling 12 domains of well-being and 4 or 5 capital stocks, the concepts become so broad that it's hard to make precise decisions within the framework. And so there is a critique from traditionalists saying that the rhetoric is too fluffy for delivering value for money, and that we have a lot more work to go in order to make our decision making more effective within a wellbeing framework. And then the third, ironically, is at the other end of the spectrum, which is saying that the government is making decisions based on a wellbeing framework that is too inimical to the traditional objectives of economic growth. So we have banned the issuing of new offshore licenses for oil and gas, for example. We're imposing requirements on water quality. We're looking for restrictions on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and representatives from those industries are saying too fast, too quick, and the wellbeing budget has gone too far. So across the spectrum, there are critiques that have been made. But I think myself that the change has been a substantive turning to a new direction. And the Minister of Finance himself would always say that we're on a journey and there is a lot of work still to be done. And the first step is the most important in that journey. And I think that's a fair point. All right, let me share my screen and see if this will work. So let me know if this isn't going on as it should. So we now have a wellbeing budget on both sides of the Tasman, and particularly statement 4 is a revisioning of addressing policy within a framework of deciding what matters for wellbeing and how we might measure it. And the first point I want to make is that this is a development that has not come out of nowhere, that there has been decades of distinctive contributions to the global program of understanding wellbeing economics and public policy from people working in Australia and New Zealand. So I always like to start with Dame Marilyn Waring, who in 1988 published the same book under 2 titles that helped launch the field of feminist economics. And she was addressing what we would now call a critique of GDP, well before that became popular. So she focused on 2 issues. And the first was that essential work for well-being, particularly within households, often by women, is generally excluded from GDP. And then secondly, environmental damage from economic activity is also generally excluded. Now, when we talk today about having regard to people and planet, these are the 2 themes that Marilyn Waring was highlighting more than 30 years ago. And that work has underpinned what Marty Grace and Lynn Craig called a distinctively Australian scholarship. Too many to mention here, but a lot of people doing work around families, around well-being, around the environment, based on that initial insight that this core measure of economic activity is failing to capture the full story of the impact of economic activity on well-being. If I look more to recent times, Dr. Catherine Trebeck deserves a mention. So an Australian economist, she's just come back from Scotland, where she's been working for many years, a co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and that includes the Wellbeing Economy Government's program. So hugely influential in helping to set the frame for the debates we are having about what wellbeing economy looks like in budget policies and the like. The new Economy Network Australia, I haven't seen anything like it really around the world, with all of its hubs looking at different themes within a new economy heading. The resurrecting of the geographical hubs from next year, trying to decentralize energy to make progress in creating new ideas and building social momentums for change. If I look at the public sector, in 2002, the Australian Bureau of Statistics and Statistics New Zealand both published landmark reports in which they were looking at finding frameworks, constructing frameworks for measuring progress with a broader well-being lens than the traditional economic focus on GDP and economic activity. I wouldn't want to oversell these reports. 10 years is a long time in this space, but there has been a concern to engage with Indigenous understandings of wellbeing within the public sector on both sides of the Tasman. And this is something to be explored much more deeply. We have made very little progress, in my view, but there is much more to be done. Gareth has mentioned at the beginning that the two treasuries both constructed wellbeing frameworks. The Australian treasuries came first in 2006, and the first draft of the New Zealand Living Standards Framework followed that example in having 5 key components of living standards as a way to try to broaden policy evaluation beyond GDP. Both of those frameworks paid tribute to the capabilities approach of Amartya Sen. And I think that's part of the distinctive character of the wellbeing and public policy framework developed in Australia and New Zealand. So this is his famous quote: the purpose of economic policy is to expand the capabilities of persons to lead the kinds of lives they value and have reason to value. So always we're coming back to the lived experience of communities as our test of the success or otherwise of economic policy programs, rather than any particular economic theory, for example. If I look at regional wellbeing frameworks, there are examples again in both countries. So there's the ACT Wellbeing Framework and the Melbourne Donut, both of them putting up a range of domains for thinking about planetary boundaries and the social foundations for a just wellbeing society. In New Zealand, the Waikato Wellbeing Project and the Canterbury Wellbeing Index are examples of regions that are tracking progress across a broad range of domains of wellbeing. The Canterbury one is famous for having an Indigenous framework sitting alongside its own framework. So He Tohu Ora is using a Māori worldview to construct a framework for monitoring well-being of populations in the region. And so this is my first point. These budgets have not come out of nowhere. They build on more than 30 years of work in both countries exploring how to go beyond GDP. It's part of what we have to offer the global conversation about well-being, that tradition over that length of period. And the second half of what I want to say is that this direct focus on well-being is important. So here's the Wellbeing Budget, the first one in 2019 in New Zealand, and it began by asking the question, what is well-being? And Nikki asked that question in the chat. And this is the answer that it provided. Well-being is when people are able to lead fulfilling lives with purpose, balance, and meaning to them. Now you can hear the echoes of Amartya Sen in this language, giving more New Zealanders capabilities to enjoy good well-being requires tackling the long-term challenges we face as a country, like the mental health crisis, child poverty, and domestic violence. And so that's the strategic step that we've just heard presented to us. So mental health crisis, child poverty and domestic violence were 3 of the strategic priorities in that first wellbeing budget. Now, this is important because, as I've discussed in some of my own work, the national budget has unique opportunities to expand people's capabilities for creating well-being for themselves, their families, their communities, and their businesses. It's not that the government puts a ladle into a big cauldron labeled well-being and throws well-being to different parts of the community. It's more like it creates platforms and foundations delivering public goods like education and health that expands people's capabilities to expand their agency for creating well-being in their communities. And if the government is focused on supporting economic growth for its own sake, it can miss those opportunities. And this has been one of the changes in direction in New Zealand, I think, is looking for new opportunities for expanding capabilities for well-being that would not have been considered under the old regime. And indeed, that was Marilyn Waring's motivation back in the 1970s, where she couldn't get childcare onto the policy agenda because that would not support economic growth in the theories of the day. The second reason why this focus on wellbeing economics is important relates to a concept called failure demand that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance published a book on earlier this year. And the key idea is this: if you pursue economic growth as the main priority, then our experience is that you create harm to people and the planet in the process. You know, people get trapped with high levels of insecurity. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. People find themselves trapped in despair and loneliness. And the big issue of catastrophic climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. You know, GDP does not measure biodiversity loss. And so we just lose sight of it. And so we are blind to the consequences of our economic policies. And then as a consequence, governments need to spend money to respond to those harms, which then becomes a justification for further growth. And so in this well-written phrase, we are caught in a cycle of paying to fix what we continue to break. This is known as failure demand. So the second message I want to give is that budgets must focus on well-being to make their unique contributions to expanding capabilities for well-being and to avoid creating failure demand. So we have the 2 budgets. I think they speak to each other very well, but it is a beginning. And my hope is that our countries will continue to make distinctive contributions to wellbeing economics, supported by strong collaborations that explore how policy can expand people's capabilities. Kua mutu taku kōrero mō tēnei rā. That finishes my talk for now. Tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. Literally, that is you, that is you. May you and I, all of us together, enjoy well-being. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I just wanted to share with you, Paul, so that perhaps you can include it in your future presentations, a phenomenal amount of work that's been done in Australia by NENA Hubs and the Australian Earth Laws Alliance on something called the Green Prince approach. And there's many, many pieces of work to it, including the steps that are enabling communities to do the real hard work of identifying how you can respect the living world and live in a place with well-being for human beings and the broader Earth community. But I like this image that I tortured an artist to do for us, James Lee, to make sure that we in Australia look at the ecological ceiling. Sure, donor economics is all about social, but we must remember place. We must remember the living world that's given us our place. And the living space is always talked about, a living space for the Earth, for human beings, but we want it to be for the whole Earth community. So our work, and particularly next year with the Green Prince Adventure, where many NENA hubs and others are embedding their approaches into this Earth-centered way of finding a flourishing healthy economic system where we can live here forever. This is one of many images that reminds us to pay attention to the mother. So I might give you that image, Paul, and invite you to plug it to others as a uniquely Aussie way of saying the donut so far is a little too much on the high level humanity. And even our beloved Will Stephan says you can't really upscale your limits to the boundaries, but you can downscale the boundaries to fit the local, and the local places and bioregions are critical. So that's just my little plug.
No, awesome. There's also an Indigenous version of the donut that's been created in
Yes.
New Zealand that turns the donut inside out.
Yes.
Within a Te Ao Māori worldview that I'll put into the chat when I've...
Yeah. Thank you. And look, we'll just wait up for questions because we've got two more wonderful speakers, and I can't wait to hear Mike and Stephanie connect some of this work from New Zealand to what's been going on just in the last week here in Australia. So Paul, thank you. That was a really helpful overview of the definitions, the analysis, and we'll definitely be bringing you back for more conversations about wellbeing economics. Thank you. So I'm now going to bring Mike in. There we go. Mike, are you there?
Yes, I am, with bells on, and loved the previous two presentations.
Yes. So Mike Salvaris, bit of a legend in the world of persevering in the face of several decades of disinterested governments. But the Australian National Development Index and the work that Mike has done is something for huge pride and celebration in Australia. And Mike is playing a really important role in continuing to watch and learn, not so much learn, but share with others about what's possible in Australia. So Mike, over to you. Tell us what you think about the federal budget, and then give us an update on everything else that's going on in your world. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle, and g'day everyone. Lovely to be talking to you. I'm speaking from Wurundjeri, Wurrung country, and I loved Gareth's opening. I must say, I look forward to the day when Australian speakers will say something as meaningful as you did in the language of the Indigenous people themselves, which we haven't yet got round to in Australia. Wurrung, by the way, is the language of the Wurundjeri people. It's where I live. But it'd be lovely to be able to have that fluency and understanding of the Indigenous culture that goes beyond the somewhat formalistic acknowledgement which we start off with.
And now, remembering, of course, that New Zealand has predominantly one language from the Maori peoples, and in Australia we're grappling with 700.
I know, but if we live in Wurundjeri country, I suppose it'd be nice, wouldn't it, if when we're acknowledging the country, we're able to say at least a phrase in the language.
And there are many language schools in Australia, so it's all open to all of us.
Yeah, that's a whole new seminar, the disappearance of the hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous languages. So to come to wellbeing budgets, we are in a very interesting time. And I want to start off with the larger context of the link between wellbeing economies and wellbeing budgets. I think the experience of the last 10 or 20 years shows that there's kind of a step process that'll take us hopefully from thinking about better ways of doing wellbeing and measuring it, building it into policies, building it into budgets, and then changing the whole jolly economy. But I think that they are linked steps, and the experience of most of the countries that have worked in this is that one tends to lead to another. You have to keep pushing. You can't just switch to a wellbeing economy as a whole paradigm shift in the economy. But the process of developing wellbeing measures helps define what we mean by wellbeing. The process of engaging citizens is crucial for the democratic requirement that we engage our citizens in the discussion of the kind of societies we want and what wellbeing means to them. And then having a formal way to define them means we can transform them into goals. And I guess wellbeing policy frameworks and wellbeing budgets is where most governments are. Not too many are thinking about wellbeing economies. So to come to Australia, in the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in the interest shown by some state governments around the idea of a wellbeing budget and wellbeing frameworks. And just last week, Treasurer Jim Chalmers announced in budget statement number 4, the whole plan to develop a wellbeing budget in Australia. And as Paul said, it does owe a great deal to New Zealand, it also owes quite a lot, and this was not acknowledged at all in the budget paper, to our own ABS's Measures of Australia's Progress, which did start out well before the OECD work. And by the way, I also want to reiterate my great admiration for my good friend, Marilyn Waring, who has been an inspiration to me. Marilyn and I actually joined forces in 2004 in Palermo at the OECD conference, where we did a sort of dual operatic act. It was in the Opera House, and Marilyn was up in the higher levels, and I was down on the floor arguing for more democracy in the OECD approach to wellbeing. And Marilyn sounded like one of those divas from the Ring Cycle Opera, I guess. She's very formidable. So in Australia, the process of the development of wellbeing measures by the ABS proceeded quite strongly, and then was dropped by the previous Howard government. There was a wellbeing framework by Treasury. It wasn't, I think, as progressive as I would have liked. It was far too much focused on the idea of consumers and economics as being the sort of sum total of wellbeing. But it was a first step, and an important one, and New Zealand, as Paul explained, took it up from that, and I think did a better job. Jim Chalmers is the current treasurer, has been saying for quite a long time that he wants to develop a wellbeing budget for Australia, and he has been closely liaising with Grant Robertson, whom he says he admires greatly, and his book, I think Grant's come out. So at the moment, the model foreshadowed in the budget paper is really the New Zealand model. It's based on, well, it gives a lot of weight to the OECD measurement framework, but I think in terms of the nuts and bolts of developing an actual budget, not just a wellbeing measurement framework, we look to the New Zealand example. And that's great, because I think it is probably the most thoroughgoing example, except I would add for Wales, because I think Wales is probably the best and most comprehensive example of wellbeing being legislated and built into all levels of government, not just the budget, policy making, evaluation, community understanding, and so on. And I guess I myself, when I was at the conference that Paul and I were also at in Wellington on public policy and wellbeing some years ago, I think I made the criticism there that I thought the wellbeing framework and the wellbeing work in New Zealand was not sufficiently underpinned by community engagement. Now, I know I attach probably greater weight to that than most wellbeing policy people, because I firmly believe that it is, especially in times of declining democracy, it's absolutely crucial that we engage our citizens, or re-engage them in a conversation about the kind of societies and communities they want, and wellbeing frameworks should reflect that. And my criticism of the New Zealand model was that it could have been, and I made this formal through a submission to the government, it should have reflected, and still can, a much greater input as to what people think are the important priorities for wellbeing. But that is perhaps a minor criticism of what is a world-leading model. Now, what Jim Chalmers has done in the budget is also a product of these rather difficult budgetary times that we live in Australia. And although we started talking to Jim, we being Andy and Fiona Stanley and I and a number of others, in 2018, I think it was, before he was treasurer, the model that he's laid out, I guess, is a prospective model for how a wellbeing budget might be developed. It still has many, many hurdles to overcome, but I think some of the key elements are reasonably sound. They do follow the New Zealand model. They are a commitment to develop a wellbeing framework, to have community engagement, although we have to push just as hard as I was suggesting we might have done in New Zealand, because that is very much underplayed in the budget paper. It does suggest the importance of community engagement, but it is a long way from suggesting it in a wholehearted way that is well thought through. It does talk about the importance of budget policy and wellbeing framework as a tool to go across government, but as yet there is not any structure. It is simply led out of Treasury, and I'm afraid I think there is always a risk that when ideas of wellbeing are led from Treasury, they just tend to incline towards some version of traditional economics. And I think that the earlier Australian Treasury framework is an example of what happens unless there is transparency, unless there is significant participation by the community. So we now have a number of organisations very interested in the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and in transforming wellbeing and public policy. So I think it's up to us in a sense to say, right, you said you wanted to do this, you said you wanted participation by research groups and community groups and experts and so on. Let us seize that agenda. The last thing we would want in this case, even though the bones, as I said, are reasonably well laid out, and I must say the Treasury was far more amenable to discussions in the last 2 months leading up to this. We have had sessions with the key people, I mean, Simon Duncan's equivalent, I guess, in Treasury, and they've been very responsive. But then again, Treasuries do have a habit of coming in on themselves and sort of reverting to type in terms of the fundamental beliefs of economic growth and development and so on. So we need to keep this process really open. We need to find structural ways to get the community involved. I think it's really healthy that Jim Chalmers keeps saying that he wants to get the New Zealand model involved. But on the other hand, you know, the reality of Australian politics can be a bit forbidding when it comes to paradigm shift. The Treasury has always been seen as having a certain role. There are sections in the Australian community that would not want it to have any other role than simply setting macroeconomic policy and doling out money. The concept of the Treasury as a sort of policy leader, even a thought leader in shifting the paradigm of government itself. And let's be frank, changing well-being or making well-being the central focus in government is a paradigm shift in the governments we have now. It's not a paradigm shift historically because Aristotle himself said, I think, that well-being is the core justification of government, the reason for existence of government. It's not a new thought, but in the last 30, 40, 50 years, it's been captured, if you like, that notion of what is the central role of government, so that it's much more, it could be more accurately described as promoting the growth of the economy rather than the well-being of the people. So we are talking about a major well-being shift. There will be great resistance, I think, if the Treasury goes beyond the fairly modest and careful dimensions. If you read the language of that paper very carefully, it is at pains to say that GDP will not be devalued, that these are measures that need to be undertaken in addition to. It doesn't say unequivocally that GDP is far too influential and that there are a lot of bad effects, side effects of the kind that Paul had on screen, that Marilyn's been talking about for ages and most of us would acknowledge. So I think it's a cautious first attempt to get this on the agenda in a way that is currently acceptable, in a climate where all of the focus was on how we deal with a massive debt. So I can acknowledge that politically it would have been very hard for Jim Chalmers as a rookie treasurer to get up and say, bugger the $1 trillion debt, we're going to go for it to change the whole budget and to a wellbeing economy. That would have been probably political suicide. So I think it is smart to have introduced it in the way he's done, to say there is an important concept that we have to move towards. This is the sort of framework for doing it. This is how we're going to do it. We're inviting community submissions. I don't think that's very common. I can't recall when Treasury actually called for submissions from the hoi polloi, the public, you know, how on earth would they know about macroeconomics? So they don't normally, it's not normally the Treasury route to ask people. So there's some good signs there. It's going to be up to us in the community, in the research sector, stakeholders to really push that and say, this is what you said you were going to do. This is what's being done. The best practice model. I keep coming back to this. Let Australia learn from all this wonderful experience of the last 20 years. We, as Australians, and I guess as New Zealanders, you'd say the same, Gareth, except when we're playing the All Blacks, when we kind of tend to accept defeat as inevitable. But in most other respects, Australians like to be gold medalists. And the argument that we've got to keep putting is, let's have the world's best practice model for wellbeing and public policy and for a wellbeing budget. And in doing so, let's build on this wonderful and so accessible and available experience. So many countries now have got a model that they can show us, that we can learn from, in terms of budgets, legislation, community engagement, policy evaluation, policy planning, and so on, that there's just no excuse now for the conservative argument that it just won't work. It does work. It will work. We've got to be brave. We've got to seize the occasion. Thanks, Michelle.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Mike. And good to hear you talking about the need for involving all folks across our societies in these bigger discussions. Obviously, the New Economy Network Australia sees that as a vital role. And that's why we formed up 5-6 years ago to bring more people in non-government in particular, but any space at all across Australia to talk about the economy. And now that the federal government is, almost to my extreme surprise, even engaging with wellbeing economic conversations, we all need to be part of that. If we're going to go down this pathway, what does that look like? Thank you so much, Mike. We'll come back at the end with a couple of questions about what you think could be some next steps for groups like NENA to engage in the bigger discussions that are going on at the government level about wellbeing economics. But now it's my great delight to ask Stephanie to join us. Thanks again, Mike. I'll just take that spotlight off you. Stephanie Kilpatrick from Vic Health, thank you so much for joining us. Would you like to share some of your insights into what's been going on in Australia, and also your fabulous work at Vic Health grappling with wellbeing economics? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'd firstly like to acknowledge that I'm on what always was and always will be the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those that are emerging. It is very exciting to be joining everyone today, a week after the federal budget update that included the aforementioned statement and commitment to measuring what matters. While the Australian Treasurer's Measuring What Matters roadmap lays out a great opportunity to build a budget framework that invests in what Australians need today, but also what we need in the future to not only survive but thrive, it is what should only be seen as a great step forward. And there must be many more steps that follow on from here. And I'd like to, first of all, really highlight that while we are very excited about this step, we really don't have a minute to waste in shoring up a wellbeing approach and embedding it across government. The last few years have really illustrated that we live in an inequitable society, and these inequities can and will affect the whole of society, even if they're rooted in certain parts of the community. And we now have the quite horrifically depressing situation of cost of living going up. And I'd like everyone to really just take a moment to think about that phrase, the cost of living, i.e. the cost of existing, the cost of basic things that every human needs, from water, electricity, food, housing, is now going up. And of course, over here in Australia, we are amid our third consecutive La Nina, and we're seeing both rural areas and inner city suburbs being flooded. So the risk presented by climate change has never been clearer. That's all those cheerful notes to really just say that we can't waste a minute. As a sector and as a community, we need to back in governments when they move in this direction, but we need to ensure that they also are building from a strong evidence base that will be required to build a strong wellbeing framework, not only for the budget, but for the whole of government decision making. We need to make sure that it is community driven, as Mike has said, and that it also focuses on responding to the needs of the community and the voices of First Nations people, culturally and linguistically diverse people, and in particular lower SES people as well, and ensure that their voices and needs are at the centre of this process. We also need to ensure that this is the start of a system-wide change, which again, other speakers have alluded to. We know budgets can deliver so much change. They could be investing in preventative health, offering subsidies for renewable energy or home solar batteries, or on the other hand, they could be delivering cuts to legal services and tax breaks for fossil fuels and harmful industries. So of course, a wellbeing budget must be a fundamental focus to a wellbeing economy approach. But the budget isn't the only way governments affect change, and they're not the only way that they can promote or not societal and environmental well-being. The government has many other levers for change, including regulations, legislation, and so on, all of which must be incorporated into a wellbeing economy framework. The Victorian Health Promotion Foundation has a swath of research about how much the day-to-day world you walk through can impact your health and well-being. From marketing on public transport affecting what you choose to eat, digital advertising increasing the amount people are sedentary, or planning regulations that determine if you have more McDonald's in your neighbourhood than grocery stores. These are the things that sit outside a budget process that must also be taken into account. And all of these things can have short and long-term effects on population health and well-being. So integrating wellbeing across government will require a breakdown of siloed thinking and instead need a focus on building holistic long-term decision-making that focuses on building up societal and environmental wellbeing for our communities today, but also ensuring the societal and environmental wellbeing for future generations and future communities. Vic Health has been working with the Victorian Council of Social Services to establish what we think, at a bare minimum, that plan to operationalise a wellbeing approach across government would look like. For us, an integrated wellbeing economy approach requires 6 key things. Firstly, as we've been talking about, the delivery of wellbeing budgets. Secondly, strong and meaningful community engagement. Again, as Mike and the other speakers have touched on, these discussions need to be future focused, but also focus on economic, social, cultural, and environmental questions. And they should be directed at tangible contributions that the people want to see going now and into the future. Thirdly, we need to ensure that this consultation is really taken on board and embedded across government. Rather than them being divided up as priorities for each department, every department should be asked, every government department and government agency should be asked to consider how they can contribute to every priority. Fourthly, we would want to see this become the basis of a public wellbeing framework or a wellbeing plan that explicitly outlines the country's wellbeing priorities, but also has specific tangible targets that a wellbeing economy should deliver on. This would require and drive a high level of collaboration across government to ensure that we're honing initiatives that are the most effective and most responsive to community needs and expectations. Fifthly, strong leadership will be required. It's so exciting to see our Federal Treasurer come on board as a champion of wellbeing budgets. But in our determination, we really think that to keep this momentum going and to keep government across the board accountable, it should be supported by a dedicated Minister for Wellbeing, who is supported by the central department of government that already has cross-government visibility. At a federal level, that could see them sitting in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, or at a state level, the Department of Premier and Cabinet, or something similar. Excuse me. Sixthly, and finally, in terms of our vision for an integrated wellbeing approach, we would want to future-proof this by passing a wellbeing economy bill. That wellbeing economy bill should include the key features of what wellbeing looks like to the community, but also embed and legislate the need to deliver wellbeing budgets, to deliver a wellbeing framework or plan, and could also include the legislatively requiring the targets that have been set out in that framework. With this suite of mechanisms, we aim to fundamentally change decision-making and ensure that the wellbeing economy approach would be embedded and sustained. These mechanisms aim to pivot the current way of working to be more holistic and future thinking. I'd also like to take a moment to plug, as Michelle alluded to, our recent toolkit that we launched. This is the 4th phase of our work with the George Institute of Global Health, and we've launched a toolkit for governments that specifically focuses on how they would develop a wellbeing framework or a wellbeing plan. And that toolkit also contains 5 key steps that are required in building a wellbeing framework. And in particular, it draws on the lessons and processes that were undertaken both in Wales and in New Zealand, but it also really asks government to reflect on the barriers to instituting a wellbeing economy, and also reflect on the power dynamics that will be required to change and really achieve societal-wide wellbeing. A tricky piece and an ambitious piece, but one that I hope will be immensely useful and will be completely necessary to creating a more well society. I'd like to end just on 2 notes about a kind of societal and community shift that we also need to make, and that everyone here can hopefully contribute to. As a sector and a community, we really need to build a universal language. And I saw someone earlier ask, what is the definition of wellbeing? Too many times I've said the word wellbeing and I get asked about yoga. And other times I end up in a 5-minute long definition. Thankfully, my comms team has helped me since, and Vic Health has recently launched our How to Create a Wellbeing Economy website that tries to really distill the concept down into an understandable language rather than policy jargon. For us, we talk about an economy that moves beyond the focus of gross domestic product or GDP and economic growth as our primary markers of progress, shifting towards indicators that prioritise health, social and environmental outcomes for people today and the generations of the future. Thank you. We know that more can be achieved when we have sectors and community working together, asking for the same tangible outcomes and utilising the same language to get our key messages cutting through the noise. Finally, over the last 2 years, we have seen daily reports, at least in Australia, on COVID numbers. This was a fundamental shift in what we were reporting on day in and day out, and obviously was a shift away from GDP and economic indicators. If we want to measure what matters, we need to be striking up that conversation on the indicators and measures that matter. The media is a hard institution to change, but with the democratised news landscape and social media, I would ask what our organisations and what we as individuals can do to push a narrative away from GDP to measures that matter. We need to show a spotlight and shine a spotlight on those measures that should be the focus of our daily conversations. This is such important work, and it is exciting to be here in this moment in Australia as we hopefully see a pivot towards a holistic wellbeing economy approach to governing. And I hope that everyone here today will get on board with that journey and take that either back into their workspace or into what they can do as a community member. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was excellent. And I hope you don't mind me interrupting you as I shared your website. I figured you would like that. And I've put the link in the chat too. So I'm just bringing our lovely guest speakers back in so that we can have, we've got a good 10 minutes for a bit of a chat. Got you there. Haven't forgotten anyone. No, Simon had to leave us. So thank you so much. And there's a lot of lovely comments and interesting links, etc. in the chat. What I would love to do is ask all of you, and of course, I'm very interested from the point of view of the New Economy Network and ordinary humans in Australia. What do you think? Perhaps Stephanie, Mike, you might start with this, but we can then turn to Gareth and Paul. What should civil society networks be doing around wellbeing economics in terms of what we are demanding when we're such an early stage of what the definitions are? And a number of folks inside NENA have expressed interest, but also gentle concern that if wellbeing economics is watered down, diluted, greenwashed, maybe it's not something we should get behind yet. What do we even mean by it? But in the meantime, what can we all do to continue any conversation that challenges just a GDP and neoclassical economic focus? Stephanie, I'll start. I might work my way back through speakers. Stephanie, what do you think folks like NENA and other people can do? Talk about it, challenge it?
Definitely. I think as I sort of ended on highlighting the conversation that matters to me, and I'm sure that everyone at my organisation will love me saying this when I don't have it approved, but you know, I'd really like to see us have a weekly report on key things that matter. You know, for something like Vic Health, where is prevention spend going? What are the outcomes? Like, we know that if we're not investing upstream, then we're having more and more acute presentations at the hospital end. So how do we pivot that narrative, and how do we as societal members and organizations pivot that narrative and keep on message again and again until someone else in that broader community and broader media landscape also take up that narrative?
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. Mike, thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that wellbeing is part of a wider conversation we need to have about the kind of societies we want, what are the key values, what are the outcomes that we need. And that's part of what a lot of this movement is about, because it's got a democratic objective of re-engaging citizens in that before we start to define for them what wellbeing is. But on the other hand, we feel very confident that with that conversation, we will get the shift towards wellbeing. Only 2 weeks ago, I think Rebecca Huntley wrote a wonderful article citing research done leading up to the budget, showing that the great majority of Australians actually support the idea of a wellbeing economy, support wellbeing as the key priority of government. So we've got a lot of community support to draw on there, which we've got to mobilise. And I love the idea of the weekly report, Steph. One of the things that Andy wants to do, and we're encouraging the West Australians to do, is we actually want an annual report in each of the 12 domains, or however many it is, of wellbeing. We don't just want an index that comes out every year saying that we're up from 3.6 to 3.7%, which is pretty more meaningless. But we need to know how the component parts of wellbeing fit together. The idea of having a domain index in health or education or justice or Indigenous wellbeing and so on, which aggregates your 12 key outcomes that have been chosen through the democratic and policy process, I think is another good one. So we've got to find ways to get the community into this conversation. We've got to take up Mr. Chalmers' kind offer to fill that space before it's done by bureaucrats who would be very defensive. So we as a community collectively have got to claim this area as our own. And we've got to say, we want our voices to be involved. We want a conversation. We want to actually have input.
And for those who are a little nervous about jumping on the wellbeing economy bandwagon, would it be sufficient for folks to start banging the drum for these alternative views, including challenging GDP and incorporating the living world into our systems more appropriately?
Yep.
Lovely. Now, Mr. Gareth and Mr. Paul, from the New Zealand point of view, in terms of, you've had 5 years of wellbeing budgets, and Gareth, we all New Zealanders only, I think, a year old now officially, or a little bit longer. What do you see as the role of civil society in supporting, challenging, or improving what wellbeing economics looks like? Gareth?
Oh, well, thanks, Michelle. I mean, I'm sort of reminded in the question of civil society, that famous Margaret Mead quote, which is, how can a small group of people change the world? In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Yeah. And this is how change has always happened. And I've just had a birthday, and I reflect my entire life has lived under a shadow of an economic change, which was dreamed up and implemented by a small group of people. So that gives me inspiration looking at history, how change has happened and how it can change again. And actually, when you look around the world is in a great deal of flux. And I never would have thought that we would have seen excessive profit taxes being placed on a lot of energy firms and other companies around the world, something I'd love to see in New Zealand. I never thought we'd see a US president wiping student loan debt. Again, something I'd love to see happen down here in New Zealand. We'd never see a president like Macron in France, who's actually challenging economic growth and declining and declaring limits, which I think is amazing. I think I was really inspired by the Vic Health Toolkit. I think that's a great sort of policy prescription, and that's something I'm really keen to dive into that website. I think that was amazing. An idea that I'd love to import into New Zealand, again, comes from Europe, the Welsh Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which has been referenced previously, which from a New Zealand sense, I think could move from wellbeing budgets to more embedded across decision-making across the public sector. And I really take on board your point, Mike. This could be a leadership role to actually hold the the role for engaging with the public and offering genuine consultation. So that's something we're looking at advocating for in Aotearoa New Zealand. We've got an election next year, so we know that politicians are open and available to new policy ideas. But on that final challenge, for us as the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, it's very much about systemic economic change. Wellbeing budgets are a great development, but we need to move from that to a true wellbeing economy.
Thank you, Gareth. Paul.
Yes, I think an important foundation is that communities are experts in their own lives. And so we come back again and again and again. What is the lived experience of communities in the current system? And as experts in their own lives, what is a vision for expanding capabilities to live better lives? So our cities are getting hotter. This is an inevitable consequence of the climate crisis. What does that mean for the lived experience of communities as our cities get hotter? We all know the tragedy of bushfires across a whole continent, flooding a third of Pakistan, deep, deep impacts on lived experience that only communities really have the knowledge to talk about. And in that space, one of the lessons we have learned in New Zealand is the importance of opening up public spaces for genuine engagement with Indigenous worldviews of lived experience. It's not a question of hearing stories and reinterpreting them ourselves. It's a question of how do we empower communities so that each community can live lives that the community values and are able to exercise agency within its own cultural traditions. And we still struggle in that space, but looking from a distance, it feels like Australia has a huge amount of work to do in opening up public spaces for genuine conversations with Indigenous communities about what well-being means in the continent now called Australia.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent. Theoretically, we're actually out of time. There are a number of questions in there in the chat, which if the speakers are super keen, please do have a look. I might end with one question around the measuring and monitoring by Janet. The question is from Janet. And the reason is, and it picks up a little bit on what Paul says, as many folks know, I work with a number of Indigenous elders through our organisation Future Dreaming and Regen Songlines. And folks such as Tyson Yunkaporta and other Indigenous friends and colleagues have gently criticised wellbeing economics as being yet another Western construct for endlessly measuring and monitoring things, but not actually making the deep cultural change and connecting to country that has to happen. Can I ask if any of you have any thoughts on responding to that criticism, but also thinking about the measuring and the monitoring? How do we do this without turning it all into another widget factory of neoclassical effort? Mike's nodding. Mike, what do you think? Oh, you're on mute, Mike. Sorry.
Sorry, I'll be quick. Measuring's an important tool, but I think in our age, we give it far too much importance. I always try to explain that in this process, the measurements are at the end of the line when we know what we want. And what we tend to forget is that we measure stuff when we don't even know what we're trying to measure or what the phenomenon looks like. So we've got to not be carried away by measurements, but they are essential in their place so that they describe more accurately what it is that we want to change and the phenomena that we think important.
Thanks, Mike. I'm not sure if Gareth has disappeared. I did not disappear him, I promise. I think he may have dropped out. Paul or Stephanie, any thoughts on not just the measuring and monitoring, but the culture and the mindset that comes with that?
I think, sorry, Paul, I jumped in ahead of you again. For me, it is one of my biggest concerns as well with wellbeing economies and wellbeing rhetoric. I think indicators are important. They're an important starting point, but indicators won't get us far enough if we don't have measurable targets that we need to get to. And that's why, Vic Health speaks about embedding those targets in legislation, embedding them in real things that governments have to be held accountable towards. So it's definitely a fair conversation point. I think for me, it is about that that substantive target that governments are held accountable to. And again, it's about having that conversation where it is about, all right, who's going to then in the community as well hold them to account? Who's going to keep governments on track with saying you are on your target, or you are getting to your target or not? Paul.
Well, I was just going to agree, Stephanie. I think health in all policies is an example of a tradition in public health that has shown the lead in this space. And some of the best conversations I have as an economist is with people from the public health tradition who are thinking, how do you design an institutional response that will support people's abilities to lead healthier lives? And inevitably, I think indicators and measures are part of an institutional framework. But we have a saying, it's called Goodhart's law in monetary economics. At the moment you choose an indicator to measure progress, it's no longer a good indicator of progress, because people try to manipulate the definition and they change things so that the measure improves. You know, it's the old, how do we warm up the room? We take the blanket off the cold person and use it to wrap up the thermostat. And yes, the indicator improves, but we've actually made things worse. So there is a need for wisdom. There's not a mechanistic approach, an indicators approach that will do all things, unless there is this tradition of public wisdom of ensuring that what you are monitoring is embedded in people's experience in their daily lives.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Look, there's so much more we could talk about, and We All Australia will be kicking off a number of roundtables and discussions in 2023, and we hope to reconnect with our New Zealand colleagues, although Gareth definitely has dropped off this call, so my apologies, folks. I'm not sure what's happened to him. So we will be continuing these conversations, and the We All Australia Hub is open to anyone who'd like to connect into it. At the moment, this year, it's been meeting probably monthly to have discussions about what everyone's been up to, and a lot of leadership within government agencies, which again, as an Australian, I'm mildly shocked and surprised by after working in 10 years of, or at least 15 years of government vacuum when it comes to some of these high level policies. So it is, despite climate change and other ecological crises and social justice problems bearing down on us, as Stephanie said, it is a very exciting time to be engaged in these issues, and we all have a part to play and a potential to shape what's going on. So please do stay connected to NENA. We have a mailing list on the website, and connect with Gareth and his folks over in New Zealand. We'll continue to have many wonderful conversations across the ditch. But as we're out of time, I would like to extend a huge thank you to our speakers. It's been a really excellent discussion. So a thank you to Simon from New Zealand Treasury, Paul Dalziel, Gareth, who I believe is back on. I'll bring him back in so folks can see him. The wonderful Mike Salvaris and Stephanie Kilpatrick, and Gareth Hughes. So thank you so much for your time today, everybody. The recording will be available if you want to watch it again or share it with others. And please stay in touch, and let's challenge and make very robust these wellbeing economy discussions, because we really need to change the system. And this is turning out to be a very important spearhead way of doing so. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, loves. See you soon.